Nearly half the homes put up for auction in Sydney last weekend didn't sell. Not because buyers didn't show up, not because there aren't enough people who need somewhere to live, but because the people who actually showed up couldn't get the numbers to work, and they walked away empty-handed. Again, here is the stat that tells you everything. The Westpac Melbourne Institute has been asking Australians every single month since the 1970s whether it's a good time to buy a home. That index has a long-run average of 120. Right now, in 2026, it has dropped to 82.9, a number this survey has never hit before in its entire 50-year history. Australia, the country that turned property investment into a national personality trait, is now recording buyer confidence at an all-time low. But here's what I haven't told you yet. For most of 2025 and into early 2026, prices were still going up nationally. And that's the thing that should make you stop and ask. If nobody wants to buy, who has been doing the buying? And why does the answer to that question matter so much more than the price number itself? Stay with me, because what this system has quietly become is something most Australians haven't fully registered yet. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. When housing affordability comes up, the conversation almost always starts with the median price. And that figure is confronting enough on its own. The national median dwelling value sat at just over $922,000 as of February 2026. In the combined capital cities, it had cleared $1 million, but the median price alone is the wrong number to look at. The number that actually tells you the state of the market is the price-to-income ratio, how many years of full household income it takes to buy a typical home. When that ratio sits at 3, economists consider housing genuinely affordable. When it hits 5, it crosses into what researchers officially classify as severely unaffordable. Australia's ratio right now is 8.2. Let that sit for a second. 3 is affordable. 5 is severe. We are at 8.2, and we've been above that severe threshold for years, still climbing. But that's just the entry cost. Here's the part that almost nobody talks about when they quote the price number: what it costs to actually hold a mortgage once you're in. Servicing a new home loan on a typical Australian property now consumes 45% of household income. The threshold economists define as housing stress, the point at which your housing costs are actively damaging your financial health, is 30%. We are 15 percentage points above it. 45% of gross income, before tax is taken out, before the grocery run or the power bill or anything else a life requires. Now, I know some of you watching this are already forming the counter-argument. If you bought your home in the late 1980s, you remember interest rates at 17%. Monthly repayments were brutal, real pain. So, when a younger generation says housing is unaffordable, it can sound like softness. But here is the distinction that matters, and it matters enormously. High interest rates are painful, but they are temporary. When rates came down through the 1990s, the burden eased. The people who held on came through with assets that had appreciated significantly. The pain was real, but it had a time limit. High prices are different. High prices are the entry ticket. And if the ticket costs 8 times your annual income before the rate environment even enters the picture, no cycle change makes that ticket cheaper. The burden doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. That's a fundamentally different problem, and we haven't even got to the hardest part yet. Let me walk you through what saving a deposit actually looks like in Australia right now. Slowly, because the arithmetic is stranger than most people realise. To buy without paying lenders' mortgage insurance, you need a 20% deposit. On a typical capital city home, that's somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 before you've touched stamp duty or legal costs. But here's the thing about that target. It's not sitting still while you save. Home values rose close to 10% year on year heading into 2026. That means for every $100,000 in your savings account, the finish line moved by roughly $90,000. You're running toward a target that keeps pulling away, and you're running it while paying rent. National rents are up 5.5% annually, the strongest quarterly gain since early 2024. A household trying to build a deposit is simultaneously watching the number grow larger and watching more of their income disappear into rent before a single dollar gets set aside. The result of all of that? It now takes the average Australian 11 years to save a house deposit. Not 5, not 7, 11. In 2012, it took around 5 years. That doubling has nothing to do with lifestyle choices or financial discipline. It is the direct mathematical result of prices rising faster than incomes, while rent consumed an ever larger share of what was left over. And 11 years in practice means you start saving at 22. And if nothing goes wrong in your life for over a decade, no illness, no redundancy, no relationship breakdown, no unexpected expense, you might be in a position to buy at 33. At which point, if prices kept moving at anything like their recent pace, the target will have moved again. That is not a housing ladder. That is a treadmill with a variable speed setting, and someone keeps turning it up. But here's what I want you to hold on to, because this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. The treadmill isn't a system failure. It's working exactly as designed, and I'll show you why. 3 years ago, 43% of Australian households on median incomes could afford to buy a typical home. Today, that figure is 14%. In Sydney, it's 10%. 9 out of every 10 median income households in Sydney cannot afford to buy a median-priced home in the city they live in. This is not a niche problem affecting a narrow slice of the population. This is a near-total collapse in the purchasing capacity of the ordinary Australian household in the country's largest city. And yet, for most of 2025, prices kept rising. The total value of Australian residential real estate sits at $12.5 trillion. Outstanding mortgages are $2.5 trillion. The market was still moving, so someone was buying. And when you look at who, the whole picture snaps into focus in a way that is genuinely uncomfortable, not because it reveals villains, but because it reveals a system. The buyers who remained most active in this market are, in large part, people who already own property, investors, people leveraging existing equity to acquire more, and doing so with advantages simply unavailable to anyone starting from zero. Two tax mechanisms sit at the heart of this. You've heard their names, but I want to explain what they actually do, in plain terms, because they're usually discussed in jargon that hides the mechanism. The first is negative gearing. When an investor owns a rental property and the costs of holding it, the mortgage interest, the maintenance, the council rates, add up to more than the rent coming in, they're running it at a loss. In most countries, an investment loss is just a loss. In Australia, that loss can be deducted against the investor's ordinary taxable salary. A high earner running a property at a $25,000 annual loss reduces their income tax bill accordingly. The government is effectively subsidizing their holding costs while they wait for the asset to appreciate. The second is the capital gains tax discount. Sell an asset you've held for more than a year in Australia, including property, and you pay tax on only half the profit. The other half is yours, tax-free. Together in the current financial year, these two concessions are costing the federal budget around $15 billion. The capital gains tax discount alone cost over $19 billion in 2024 to 25, and both concessions combined are forecast to cost $181 billion over the coming decade. Now here is the context that makes those numbers land. In the same year that emergency housing services reported demand beyond their capacity, in the same year that rental vacancy rates sat at or below 1% in most capital cities, and rent assistance queues stretched to lengths not seen in a generation, the Australian government was spending more on tax concessions for property investors than it allocated to social housing, homelessness services, and rent assistance combined. More subsidising landlords than housing people with nowhere to live. Same year, same budget. I want to be precise here, because the easy version of this argument is a moral attack on individual landlords. And that's not what this is. Most people with investment properties are making rational decisions inside a set of rules that successive governments have designed, maintained, and actively defended. The problem is not the individual investor. The problem is the rules themselves. At scale, those rules systematically advantage people who already own assets over people who don't. And the long-run consequence of that is something even more significant than unaffordability. This is where the story changes. There's a structural truth at the center of all of this, not a statistic, a reality about what Australian housing has quietly become. Intergenerational wealth is now the primary dividing line in this market. If your parents own property, if there is real estate equity somewhere in your family, you have a path in. Maybe it's a deposit contribution. Maybe it's a loan guarantee against their equity. Maybe it's an inheritance that arrives eventually. Whatever form it takes, the bridge exists. If your parents don't own property, the architecture of this market works against you at every turn. The tax concessions flow to owners. The capital appreciation flows to owners. Every year this continues, the wealth of people who already hold assets compounds, and the barrier faced by people who don't compounds with it. The long consequence, played out across a generation or two, is that home ownership stops being something you achieve. It becomes something you inherit. Property stops being a milestone accessible through work and discipline and becomes a birthright, something that passes from parent to child, not through merit, but through the accident of which family you were born into. To those watching who bought in the 1980s or 1990s, when the price-to-income ratio was 3 or 4, you did the right things. The system rewarded your effort, and there is nothing wrong with that. But the system that rewarded you has been progressively reshaped in ways that make it structurally unlikely your children and grandchildren can replicate what you did. Not because they lack discipline, because the rules changed, and many of the people with the most influence over those rules were, and are, the people who had already won under the previous ones. Now here's what that means at scale, and this is the part that should concern every Australian, regardless of age or whether you own or rent. Every election cycle delivers a new housing affordability scheme. The first home guarantee, home builder, shared equity programs, state-level stamp duty concessions. Each arrives with the language of genuine reform. Each has had close to no structural impact on affordability, and some have quietly made the problem worse. Here's why, and it's simpler than it sounds. When you give first home buyers additional purchasing capacity, a grant, a deposit guarantee, a lower entry threshold, without meaningfully increasing the number of homes available to buy, you haven't improved affordability. You've given more people the ability to bid against each other for the same limited supply. The extra money doesn't stay in the buyer's pocket. It flows straight through to the vendor in the form of a higher price. The seller captures the subsidy. The buyer ends up with a larger mortgage, and the exact same structural problem slightly deferred. The supply side of this equation is where the real failure lives. Over the last decade, Australia's population grew by 8 million people. Over that same period, the total number of properties listed for sale fell by 33%, from 339,000 down to just 228,000. The number of homes available to rent dropped 47%, and closing that gap through new construction has become extraordinarily difficult. Builder insolvencies have surged. Construction costs are up 30 to 40% since the pandemic. Housing approvals remain near decade-low levels. The planning and zoning systems in every state have consistently proven more responsive to the concerns of existing owners than to the needs of people who want to join them. The ladder didn't just get harder to climb, the bottom rung was quietly sawn off. Which brings me to the part that nobody's talking about enough. Because when you put all of this together, something starts to happen that, once it takes hold, becomes very difficult to reverse. Housing becomes too expensive for ordinary workers. Those workers, especially the younger, more mobile ones, start to leave. In the financial year 2023 to 24, more than 104,000 people left Sydney, around 2% of the city's entire population, moving elsewhere in Australia. Only 63,000 moved in to replace them, producing a net domestic loss of over 41,000 people in a single year. Sydney is now the only major Australian capital that would be shrinking without overseas arrivals. The people who are supposed to form the next wave of buyers are leaving the city. Sydney's population technically grew because of international migration. But the people arriving are predominantly renting, not buying. The buyer base is contracting even as the headline population number climbs. And here's where the loop closes. When the buyer pool shrinks, developer confidence falls and new supply stalls. When supply stalls and population pressure returns, prices spike again from a higher base. Then the affordability deteriorates further, more people leave, and the cycle restarts. Every iteration worse than the last. Every link in that chain is visible in the Australian data right now. And the cities where it has run longest are the ones now showing the clearest signs of stalling. Prices in Sydney and Melbourne decelerating, and in the most recent weeks, beginning to fall. So where does this go? And what would actually need to change? I want to be direct about that, because the housing conversation in this country tends to collapse into two unhelpful positions. Either the market's about to crash, or it always goes up, and she'll be right. Both are lazy. Neither is useful to anyone making real decisions about their lives. Genuine structural reform, the kind that would actually shift the trajectory rather than tinker at the edges, would require, at minimum, a rebalancing of the negative gearing and capital gains tax settings so that the largest concessions no longer flow predominantly to multi-property investors at the expense of people trying to buy their first home. It would require sustained large-scale investment in housing supply, rezoning established suburbs for density, overcoming the political resistance of existing homeowners who reliably oppose new development near their streets, and funding the infrastructure that makes denser living workable. And it would require replacing stamp duty, the large one-off tax that punishes people for moving, with a broad annual land tax, which the OECD recommended explicitly in 2026. None of this is fantasy. Tokyo, a city of 14 million people in one of the most land-scarce nations on Earth, has kept housing broadly stable for 20 years through consistent density policy. Vienna runs one of the most affordable rental markets in Europe through sustained public investment stretching back decades. Singapore transformed its housing system in a single generation through government-led construction at scale. These are not accidents. They are the result of governments choosing repeatedly to prioritize the long-term housing needs of their populations over the short-term comfort of people who already own. Australia has made different choices, consistently, across many governments over a very long time. And I want to say something directly to those watching who are in their 60s or older, because this matters, and I don't think it gets said clearly enough. You are statistically the most powerful voting bloc in this country. The people who vote most consistently in Australia are over 50. The people most harmed by the current housing system are under 40. That gap is a significant part of why the policy settings have been so durable and so difficult to shift. The question of whether any of this actually changes is, in large part, a question of whether older Australians with property wealth decide that what this system is doing to their children and grandchildren is something they are willing to use their political voice to fix. That is not a comfortable thing to say. But it is an honest one, and most people watching this know it's true. This is not a crash story. Crashes are loud. They generate emergency measures and front-page headlines and a clear moment when everyone agrees something broke. What is happening in Australian housing is slower than a crash. So slow that for many people who have already won, it barely registers day to day. The rules didn't break all at once. They changed gradually, across 30 years of quiet decisions, each individually defensible, collectively transformative. And a great many Australians, including many who have done very well out of those changes, haven't fully absorbed what those changes have created. The price-to-income ratio is 8.2. Severely unaffordable begins at 5. It takes 11 years to save a deposit that used to take 5. 45% of household income goes to servicing a new mortgage. Buyer confidence is at a 50-year low, in a country that has never been more house-obsessed. That is not a housing market functioning under stress. That is a wealth transfer system, one where the direction of transfer has been decided, quietly and durably, by the people who got there first. The house didn't get expensive. The country changed around it. And the only honest question left is whether enough people of every age understand that clearly enough to decide they want something different. Because wanting something different is where every reform this country has ever made actually started.